Welcome, good evening. It's about 7 on the dot, last day of July. I know this is a week off for most everyone, including myself, because of the SABR convention next week, starting on Wednesday. They didn't want any Zoom meetings going on during that. So, before we get started, two quick things is one, for those of you who might be coming, if you're local, to the game at the Orioles in September, they will be paper tickets, just because some people don't have smartphones, and it's easier to track from the Orioles standpoint for a group potentially 60, 70, 80 in size. And also, if you know anybody who is coming to that game, we're looking for one or two presenters on their research or book. So if you're going to be there in person, just reach out and let me know. I know it's I don't know, at least in Baltimore, it's sunny. I was at today's game. I saw Jackson Holliday got his first home run, grand slam, and we beat the Jays and took, what was it, 3 out of 4. And the Yankees swept Philadelphia, so we're still neck and neck for first place. So I will turn it over to Drew Sullins, and he will tell us about his research, his project, where he's from. Do the standard introduction, Drew, if you don't mind. And we'll take questions at the end, and I will admit people if they join. So go ahead, Drew. Got to unmute.
Oh, all right, Peter. Thanks very much. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone's time for being here tonight and listen to me talk about a topic that I'm really interested in, and I hope that you all will find it very interesting as well. It's something near and dear to my heart. My name is Drew Sullins. I am a retired U.S. Army colonel. I now work in managing television technology projects for Sinclair Broadcast Group up in Hunt Valley. My post-Army retirement job, or one of them, I was working in cybersecurity before that. But for 10 years, and I'll talk, this is a lot to do with the genesis. For about 10 years, I sat on the board of directors for the Maryland Museum of Military History down at the 5th Regiment Armory. And that's kind of where this project was born. When I was in my duties as a director at the Maryland Museum of Military History, and I've put together a PowerPoint presentation about the team. And so what I would like to do is share the screen, go into presentation mode. I'll take you through it, and then hopefully leave a little bit of time at the end and answer any questions that you guys have. Just a couple of things about this. This is a living project, meaning that it's not quite nearly complete yet. I still have a lot of work to do. My ultimate objective is to move towards a book, because I want to tell the story of these men that played on this military baseball team that was pretty good, and they have some compelling stories. And then the story of how we found out about the team and uncovered who was on it is pretty interesting too, or at least I think it is. Yeah, without any further ado, let me go to my presentation here, and we'll get started. All right, hope everybody can see that. Let me go to,
Yep.
Let me get it into presentation mode here for you guys. Okay. So again, I'm Colonel Retired Drew Sullins, and that is the 29th Infantry Division's post-VE Day Victory in Europe baseball team. The 21 members, and it looks like about three soldiers that were part of the support staff that helped that team pull that off. I actually, before I knew that photograph existed, before I'd ever laid eyes on that photograph, a couple of years before, I was trying to figure out what this team was all about. I'll go into that, but that's my cover page on these guys. And that the program, the scorecard up there in the right-hand corner is the cover page of a scorecard that was handed out at Soldiers Field in Nuremberg when they played for the championship of Germany, of occupied Germany. They played the 71st Infantry Division of the 3rd Army, Patton's 3rd Army, for that championship. They got swept in 3 games. All 3 games are really competitive, but that's the cover of that scorecard right there. So I know this isn't a military history briefing. It's a baseball briefing, but just very quickly, I've got one quick slide on the 29th Infantry Division in World War II so that you guys kind of have some perspective on what the division was all about. It was a National Guard division mobilized from Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey, and D.C. It was the first Army combat division to arrive in England in October of 1942, and it was one of the 5 assault divisions that participated in D-Day on June 6, 1944. It is literally one of the glory divisions of World War II, even though from an individual awards and decorations point, it is far from decorated like it's a glory division. Many other divisions, for example, had many Medals of Honor winner. 29th Division had 2, many Distinguished Service Crosses, Silver Stars. The commanding general just wasn't a big believer in individual awards and decorations. We'll talk about him in a minute, but they compiled one hell of a combat record and paid one heck of a price. Killed in action, the second highest of any Army division in World War II. So they paid in blood and guts, and there's a lot of pride, even to this day, from folks that served in the 29th Infantry Division, and I would hope they would take pride in knowing about that baseball team that represented them in the ETO playoffs in the summer of 1945. Okay, so background on Army baseball in 1945. Of course, the Army had long had baseball. It's always been a big part of the Army. It's a game that travels well. You know, you need a bat and a ball and a glove and a piece of dirt or land or grass, and you can play. And the Army has always played baseball, of course, going back to the Civil War. But what General Eisenhower's particular problem in the summer of 1945 is that occupying Germany presented Army leadership with a lot of serious personnel-related issues, a lot of discipline problems. Occupation duty in a country is tedious and boring and fraught with all sorts of issues. And in Germany in 1945, weapons, alcohol, other vices were all too available for American soldiers. I know that we kind of have this mythological perception that all of our GIs were well-behaved and did the right thing and were benevolent occupiers. But that was certainly the case for most of them. But for some, they were troublemakers. And General Eisenhower, Lucius Clay, and some of the other generals that were high-ranking in the occupation forces wanted to try to avoid that. Seasoned, mature veterans were going home every day, so the guys that could manage those kinds of problems had enough points to rotate home, and they'd served in combat, and they were going, and they were being replaced by young, green, inexperienced, impressionable troops. Fraternization was a problem with German civilians, mostly American men and German girls, and physical fitness was a problem because the war with Japan was not settled. And, you know, by mid-August of 1945, they still weren't sure if they were going to have to pull divisions out of Europe and send them to the Pacific to invade Japan. So there was a lot going on there. So to address this problem, Eisenhower decided that we need to give these kids, young people, a reminder of home, things from home that they can cherish, things for home that they can celebrate, that they can participate in. And one of those things was baseball. And he tasked a colonel, later a general, but a colonel in World War II named Kenneth Fields, who had played football at West Point, to set up an ambitious, competitive baseball sports program that they could participate in both at an intramural level inside of each of their units, but then each unit would have an all-star team of sorts that would represent that unit and play in a playoff series to see who had the best baseball team in the European theater in 1945. At that time, it's kind of estimated, we don't have exact numbers, but we think there were about 500 Major League Baseball veterans and active players that were drafted into the Army and in the European theater. About 2,000 minor league players of various levels of the minor leagues were in the European theater, and God knows how many college players, a bunch. So there was a lot of talent to choose from to build this out. So the project's beginning. So that's kind of the background on Army baseball. And it started in 2016, with me anyway, in a conversation that I had with Joe Balkowski. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Joe, but he's the historian. He's an Army historian, and his specialty is the 29th Infantry Division. Those are the 5 books that he's written on the division and its journey during World War II, and actually, frankly, in the train-up for D-Day. A fantastic author and historian, a really great guy. And he's also a baseball nut. He's from Queens, New York. He's a lifelong, well, he was born before the Mets existed, but he became a Mets fan as a young kid and loves his New York Mets. And he and I would get together, and as often as we would talk military history, we would talk baseball. Joe and I were talking one day in the museum, and I had a question about the Plymouth Yankees. And the Plymouth Yankees were the baseball team of the 116th Infantry Regiment, which was part of the 29th Division. And they called themselves the Plymouth Yankees because they were billeted, the 116th Infantry was billeted in and around Plymouth, England. And they won the 1943 European Theater of Operations World Series. So they had a pre-D-Day World Series. They didn't do it in 1944. They were a little too busy fighting, but they did it in 43. And the Plymouth Yankees of the 116th Infantry Regiment won it. And they had like one or two low-level minor leaguers on the club, and a bunch of high school kids or high school players that had played in high school. And that was about it. And they managed to win it. And the 29th really celebrates the Plymouth Yankees. And I was asking Joe about that. And he said, you know, it's funny you mentioned that. He said, because the post-VE baseball team that the 29th had was even better than the Plymouth Yankees. It had some really accomplished athletes and players on the team. And he told me, he said, you know, but I've looked and looked and looked. I've only heard about it anecdotally from other veterans. But I think the team was managed by a college football hero named Perossi, who was an All-American at the University of Iowa. And Joe told me that. And there's something about that conversation that really intrigued me. And so I was kind of, you know, I'm going to try to find something out about this baseball team. I had no idea that I was going to take it to where it is today. Because I literally started, and what you see in that quote right there was all I knew about it. I didn't know anything else about it except maybe this guy Perossi managed the team and that it existed, and that the historian of the 29th Infantry Division told me that it existed. So I really wanted to tell this story because it blends two of my favorite things, military history and baseball, but I also knew it would be extremely challenging. It would require me to become part historian, part private investigator. There was very, very little to go on. The 29th was meticulous about keeping records until after VE Day. After the Germans surrendered, they got sloppy about it. It might have been because people were coming in and out of the division at a great rate and rotating home, but there were no military records, no team photos in the archives that I could find, no box scores of games, no relevant information could be easily obtained. And then, of course, life got in the way. I was an Army colonel, and I was closing out my 34-year career and transitioning to the civilian world. I was being a dad to my boys out here in Howard. I live in Howard County, and they're playing youth baseball, and I'm coaching their teams. And then I'd gotten remarried. I'm divorced from my first wife, got remarried to my second, and so I had a lot going on. And so finally, about a year or so later, I decided, you know, I'm going to start poking into this. So I started doing some research online, and there's a military baseball website out there called Chevrons and Diamonds. And I contacted Chevrons and Diamonds to try to get a little guidance on maybe how I might be able to pursue this. And it turns out it was a very fortuitous conversation for me. And then in January of 2020, with the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic, I found time to research from home. We were locked down. We couldn't go anywhere. Nothing was open. And all of a sudden, except for when I was working remotely from home for my job, I had a ton of time. And so that's when this really got started in earnest, about January 2020. Note on the sources that I used. So I used a bunch of sources. Some of this was unconventional, but Baseball Reference, of course, e-yearbook. I'll talk a little bit about how high school and college yearbooks came into the picture to help figure out who these guys were. Facebook for social media engineering. As I located and was able to identify players on this team, I have reached out to several of their children and grandchildren and gotten some great information from them. A lot of folks have been very helpful with that. The National Archives, the University of Iowa Libraries, the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. I mean, if I thought a source, and of course SABR, and if I thought a source could help me, I would go to that source and I would absolutely use it. And I would. And so those are not some, but not all of the sources I used. And then there was a military record that was particularly important to my efforts. And one was called a morning report. And the morning report is a document that back in World War II, even up through Vietnam, every company level unit in the Army had to fill out one of these reports. And the company clerk would fill it out, and he would put, if anything significant happened to a soldier in the company that day, the clerk had to note that in the records. So if a soldier was killed in action, seriously wounded in action, lightly wounded in action, if he was a non-battle casualty, if they were transferred, sent to the hospital, sick call, whatever, a note had to go into this morning report. And I've been able to, these morning reports were absolutely essential in being able to identify positively 12 members of the team who I could confirm were in the 29th Infantry Division. The morning reports provided an important clue. Now, when these morning reports, when they exist in their real form, they're in 3-ring binders, and for the entire 29th Division, because about 30,000 soldiers served in the 29th Division during the war, it's about 40 to 50 3-ring binders, each with about 300 to 400 pages in it. So I couldn't go through all that. It would have taken me forever. But when I was on the board of directors of the museum, these morning reports were really important, and we wanted to find a way to do quick research in it. So we brought some interns from Stevenson University into the 5th Regiment Armory to the museum, and we had them do data entry in an Excel spreadsheet. And what you see down there at the bottom is that's if you did it in our spreadsheet, if you did a search for a soldier named Jack Dobratz, those are all the morning report entries that he appears in from his unit during his time in World War II. So these morning reports became very, very instrumental to what I was doing. And then they also would be problematic because when we got a hold of these reports from the National Archives and made copies to bring back to the 29th Division archives in Baltimore, we only had enough money to pay a researcher to bring everything through May 8th, 1945. So we had everything through VE Day, but we didn't have the occupation period of Germany. Those records are in St. Louis at the National Archives Annex there, and they weren't available to me. It turns out that would be interesting because there was an influx of transfers to hit the 29th Division, including several who would become players on the baseball team, and that was after VE Day, May 8th, 1945. So the morning reports were critically important for me. So when I talked to Sean Hennessy from Chevrons and Diamonds, he told me about a website that a guy named Gary Bedingfield runs called Baseball in Wartime. I didn't know about it. And he's a guy based out of the UK, and he's a military baseball aficionado, and he's a Brit. You know, you don't run into too many baseball aficionados that are British. But this guy has a website. Encourage you to check it out, and he's got a lot of good information on there. And he had a partial roster, and this is the first time I'd ever seen a partial roster of the 29th Infantry Division's team. And you can see right there in the partial roster, there's a few first and last names, but not many. Mostly it's just last names. But you can see that, you know, Don Calloway, for example, he was actually a pretty easy soldier to identify for me because he was playing for the Chicago White Sox when he was drafted into the Army. He was a major leaguer, so it's easy to find information on Don Calloway. Same thing with Whitey Moore. Whitey Moore pitched for the Cincinnati Reds, and he was a pre-war major leaguer, and information on him was pretty easy to find. And then Perossi, Erwin Perossi, it turns out, was, you know, he was easy. But the rest of these guys, I didn't know who James Robinson was, Earl Gelf, Herbert Beidencap. I mean, I had no clue. And so, but I was determined to find out who these people were, who they were in the pictures, to put a name with a face with the name, and then tell their story the best I could. So I went after the low-hanging fruit first, and that was pretty easy. With Bedingfield's partial roster, the following players I said were easily identified. I've already gone through those. And I simply didn't know where to start. So when I did reach out to Sean Hennessy, Chevrons and Diamonds, he was a great collaborator of me. He's a SABR member. He lives out in Seattle, Washington. He's a Navy guy. I won't hold that against him. He's a Navy vet, but he loves military baseball, particularly from that World War II era. And he provided some early clues for me, like Jay DeBratz. Now, if you'll notice, I'm going to back up a little bit. There's nobody named DeBratz in that partial roster. No DeBratz. And it's actually not DeBratz. It's misspelled. It's Dobratz. So that was a medal. So when they won the 7th Army Championship, the Army had this storehouse of captured German sports medals. And they decided, you know what? Let's give out these German sports medals as a trophy to the winning team. And they had the back of them engraved. On the front, it's got some German slogan and some German athlete-looking guy. But this one went to Jack Dobratz, who was on the 29th Division's team. So right off the bat, I learned that the partial roster wasn't perhaps complete and it might have had some errors on it. But Sean had a lot of good stuff. He had that scorecard from one of the championship games. And then Sean helped me, and this was really important. He helped me locate the first photos of the 29th Division's team, and it was from the Guelph collection. And it's an interesting story and kind of a funny story on how we did it. But Sean is a big eBay guy. He gets on eBay a lot, and he's always looking for Army Special Services, baseball memorabilia to collect, jerseys, baseball bats, balls, whatever. And he's got all these search terms, and he had loaded up a search term for 29th Infantry Division baseball or something like that. And one day he's looking at eBay, and his search popped, and there was a photo album for sale on eBay from a World War II veteran named Earl Guelph. And Earl Guelph played on the 29th Division baseball team. And so his photo album, his personal photo album from World War II, was for sale, and Sean bid on the photo album and got the photo album. And then we later found out from contacting the family that photo album became available for sale for an interesting reason. So Earl Guelph had, I think it was 5 or 6 children. And one of his sons, he's from DeSoto, Wisconsin, and one of his sons, well, let's say he ran a lounge or a bar where exotic dancing took place, you know, and there were some things going on in this bar that were not legal, and some of the girls that worked in it were arrested, and Earl Guelph's son was arrested, and he needed to raise money for his legal defense. And just like baseball memorabilia commands a big price, so does military memorabilia, and particularly from World War II and the Civil War. And so he was selling off to raise money for his legal defense all of his father's World War II memorabilia that his dad had collected and kept over the years. His dad was, by this point, passed away, and this photo album was in there. And until we saw this photo album, and I've got some pictures on the next slides, we'd never seen pictures of the 29th Division's team. We couldn't find a single photograph anywhere. So this was really earth-shattering for me to see these pictures that I'm about to show you. So this is a team photo. This is the 29th Division Blues and Grays after they won the 7th Army Championship in Mannheim, Germany. And to date, and I'll go through it later in the presentation, I've identified 18 of the 21 players you see there in that picture. And it's taken me a few years to do it. And there they are. There's the first 4 right there. So Don Calloway, major leaguer from the Chicago White Sox. Irv Perassi, University of Iowa College Football All-American. But Perassi also was in the spring. He played for the Cardinals in the Cardinals minor league organization. Branch Rickey signed him, and he was playing baseball when he got drafted into the Army. He had graduated at Iowa and had his degree. And then in the lower left, there's Lloyd Whitey Moore. And then there's Earl Guelph himself. Because we had the photo albums, Earl was very easy to identify. So now I've got a team photo, and I know who 4 guys are. So I'm off and running, off to the races, right? And I thought maybe I could do this in a week or two. And here it is, you know, 4 some odd years, 5 years later, and I'm still got 3 more guys that I've got to positively identify. This is another of the photos that was in the Guelph collection. 6 of the players. This photo was taken in Bremen, Germany, up on the northern coast of Germany. That's where the 29th was pulling occupation duty. They had to advance out of the Bremen Enclave Championship to go to the larger tournament down in Bavaria to play for the German championship. And there's 6 guys on the team. And so there's Perassi, he was the player manager. And there's Whitey Moore from the Cincinnati Reds. And there's Don Calloway from the Chicago White Sox. But I had no idea who the guys on the right were, the 3 guys on the right next to them. And I was really intrigued by the guy in the middle there, the short Mexican-American gentleman. I didn't know who he was. And, you know, the Army, you guys are probably all, at the very least, armchair historians. And so, you know, the Army was segregated in World War II and not yet integrated. And that applied to African Americans and Asian Americans. You couldn't serve in an all-white Army unit. But it didn't apply to Mexican Americans. If you were brown and a Mexican American, the Army didn't think it was any problem. You could serve in an infantry division that was pretty much an all-white infantry division, but it really wasn't all white. It was white and brown. And this guy was obviously on the 29th Division's baseball team, and he was not a Caucasian. And I was just really curious that, you know, Callaway and Moore were interesting because their stories in Major League Baseball were interesting. Parasi's got an interesting backstory, but I was like, what in the hell? What is this guy's story? I had to learn this. And if it wasn't for a happy accident, an incredible stroke of luck, I might never know who he was. And I'll get into that in a little bit, in a couple slides down the road here. And of course, I found out I know who everyone in this picture is today. Couple more pictures. This is the starting 9 from the last game of the championship series to advance to the finals for Southern Germany, and that's, you know, Don Callaway sitting on the bench front and center there. Parasi, again, I didn't know who the other guys were in this picture for a long time. I only knew who those two were. The guy in the middle, I didn't know who he was, but he's also the guy sitting on the bench second from the left in that picture. And then the guy standing next to those townhouses or those row houses, and that picture was taken in Mannheim, Germany, is Whitey Moore from the Cincinnati Reds. Actually, St. Louis Cardinals. He was with the Cardinals by the time he got drafted into the Army. Now, this picture really threw me for a loop because it was in the Guelph photo album. And I'm looking at this picture, and that's clearly Don Callaway from the White Sox. Don't know who the guy in the middle was when I first looked at it. I know today, and I'll talk about who he was in a minute. And then that's Whitey Moore from the Reds. And I'm like, well, that's not the 29th Infantry Division patch on their ball caps or on their left shoulder. That's another Army division, and it turns out it's the 69th Infantry Division. And I thought, that's really odd. Why would these guys be in the pictures with the 29th Division team, but then they're sitting in 69th Division baseball uniforms? And that kind of threw me for a little bit of a loop. And here's what I found out. So the Army decided in June of 1945 that they were going to send the 69th Infantry Division home and leave the 29th Division in place. And this rankled a lot of 29th Division veterans because they landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day, and the 69th Infantry Division didn't even really get into combat until January of 45. So they only saw a couple of months of combat, whereas the 29th Division spent the better part of a year in a living hell. And so, but that was the decision the Army made. We're going to keep the 29th in Germany. We're going to send the 69th home. But there were 3,262 enlisted and 297 officers who did not have enough points to transfer and go home. And they were transferred into the 29th Infantry Division. And you can see from this copy of the division newspaper that they were welcomed with open arms. You can see from the picture, it says 69th losses, 29th gain. That's Don Callaway of the White Sox. He's now going to join the 29th Division's baseball team, as will Whitey Moore, Earl Guelph, Bill Seal, and potentially up to 3 more players. I've got 3 more players to identify, and those players might have come from the 69th Division. I don't know. And that was a very fortuitous occurrence for the 29th Infantry Division because it made their ball club a lot better. And then I got another eBay lucky break. This was my eBay lucky break, Sean Hennessy. So I decided to set up search parameters in eBay for 29th Division stuff too. And one night I get this alert in my phone that 11 issues of the division's post-war newspaper from the month of July 1945 just popped up for sale on eBay. And these are really rare. I knew about the 29 Let's Go newspaper, but again, the 29th Division didn't do a great job saving stuff after the Germans surrendered. And there's a couple of copies in the archives, but nobody's got a complete set of these newspapers. And it was produced, I think, 2 or 3 times a week. And so I've never seen 11 copies of it anywhere altogether. And I'm thinking, well, July 1945, the baseball team was playing and being formed in the intramural league of the 29th Division, from which the all-star team was selected. Those guys were playing. I said, there's got to be articles about the baseball team in here. So I had to choke and swallow hard because the person that had these knew they were valuable and probably, in my estimation, wanted a couple $100 more than they were worth. but I went ahead and paid, and I shelled out of my pocket. My wife, I think, thought I needed to be committed to an asylum for doing this. But I shelled out about $500 for these 11 newspapers. And because at this point I was starting to get obsessed, and I really wanted to find out what was in there. And sure enough, as you can see, the two little clippings on the left there, the middle screenshot is my order from eBay where I bought these. And then the clipping on the left, those are the profiles. The 29th Division they took their intramural league that they played in late May, June into early July. All the different units of the 29th Division each had their own teams. The 115th Infantry, the 116th Infantry, the 110th Field Artillery, they all had their own teams. They had a tournament. And from that intramural league, they selected the division's all-star team, and the division's all-star team became the Blue and Grays. And so I was able to identify a couple of players from these profiles and then learn a lot about them, you know, from these profile articles. And so this was an insanely lucky break that I got on eBay. And now I'm the proud owner of some very expensive World War II unit newspapers. But I'll hang on to those. So here's the team, and I'm just going to go through the team, and then I'll take some questions, and I'll talk about each guy briefly, try to get through it pretty quick so that we have plenty of time for questions. But before I do, I want to talk about the guy behind the team, and that was the division's commanding general. So Gerhardt, Charles H. Gerhardt was an interesting guy, to say the least. He was United States Military Academy class of 17. His father was an Army general, so he was a legacy. He was a cavalryman, a superb trainer of soldiers, a very strict disciplinarian, and he was a highly controversial officer. Everybody knows that George Patton was controversial. Very few people know about Charles Gerhardt. And why was he controversial? Well, he set up a whorehouse, basically, in France for his men. They were in a brief respite after they'd taken the port at Brest, and he thought his men needed some recreation. So he told the division surgeon to go out and recruit some local French women. And then he was a cavalryman and a world-class polo player. And so they called the place the Blue and Gray Corral, and they had to put a sign out front and said riding lessons were this much money, this many francs. And the division chaplain went absolutely bananas. And he tried to get General Gerhardt to shut it down, and he wouldn't. So he went over his head. And General Omar Bradley ended up having the direct order to shut this thing down. It was only open for about 48 hours. You know, I'll tell you, in today's Army, if a general did that, he'd be summarily fired and drummed out of the Army the next day. But Gerhardt got away with it, even though there was a big investigation. General Gerhardt was not liked by his peers and many of his superior officers. Lieutenant General Raymond McLean, who was his corps commander, wanted to fire him. Lieutenant Joe Collins, his commander in the 9th U.S. Army, wanted to fire him when the 29th was organized under the 9th Army. Omar Bradley himself, who became a 5-star, he wanted to fire this guy, and they were never able to do it. A retired brigadier general who worked for Gerhardt during the war, or was subordinate to Gerhardt in an infantry regiment, told me that Gerhardt had blind ambition beyond belief. And a lot of people felt that Gerhardt was really careless with the lives of his men, that he wanted to accomplish greatness so bad, he was willing to pour American soldiers into a meat grinder to do it. And that's why the division suffered such horrifically high rate of casualties. You know, and they used to say about Gerhardt, he didn't command one Army division, he commanded 3. One in the field of battle, one in the hospital, and one in the cemetery. And, you know, that's what they said about Gerhardt. So why? And he was extremely, unbelievably competitive. If he was going to do it, then by God, he was going to be a winner. And he felt that way about the baseball team. And so historians believe that he was protected by Eisenhower. Now, why would Ike protect Gerhardt? Ike was an upperclassman at the academy. I think Ike graduated when Gerhardt would have been in his 2nd year, and Gerhardt was the finest athlete of his day at West Point, and Eisenhower admired great athletes. And he lettered in football, baseball, and basketball. He was the Army's quarterback, so he was a football hero. Quarterbacked Army to a 9-0 record in 1916 in a co-national championship with Pittsburgh. In 1915, he led the Army baseball team to an 18-3 record. He had the nation's top batting average at 407. He was an extremely skilled polo player. He was an equestrian judge at the 1932 Olympic Games. And so we don't really know for sure. We just know that Gerhardt did a lot of things that would have gotten another general canned. And all these kinds of things almost got Patton canned. And Patton was certainly more important to the war effort than Gerhardt. And yet Gerhardt survived. Now, he didn't really survive unscathed. He survived, but at the end of the war, he was demoted from major general all the way back to full colonel. He was the only general coming out of World War II out of the regular army that was reduced from 2-star general to full colonel. That's 2 ranks back. I retired a full colonel. My next promotion would have been 1 star if I'd have competed for it. And then the next promotion after that would have been 2. But so that's Gerhardt. Now, Gerhardt needed an architect. He needed somebody to build this team for him. And this is the guy who did it. And I guess everybody here is from Baltimore. And this guy is like Baltimore royalty. When I didn't know who he was, I'm not a Baltimore native, but I came here. Tommy Dukart was a rich kid, very wealthy kid from Baltimore. And he still served. He was in the 2nd to the 110th Field Artillery Battalion in the Maryland National Guard. He landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. He was a lacrosse All-American at Johns Hopkins. Gerhardt liked athletes. And then after the war, he was really involved in the Baltimore sports community. He was the PR director for the Colts. He wrote the Colts fight song. He was a charter member of the Orioles Advocates, a major promoter of lacrosse. He had a TV show on WMAR. He was a sports columnist in the News American. His family actually founded the News American. Dukart family, one of his relatives did. He literally traces, he's got a descendant that was an aide, one of the aide-de-camps during the American Revolution of George Washington. One of his great-grandfathers fought in the Battle of Baltimore in September of 1814, was in Edward Asquith's company of sharpshooters. His great-grandfather was was a career Navy sailor, did like 42 seaborne engagements during the Civil War, and then much later was one of the founding naval officers to start the Naval Academy, the United States Naval Academy. And so Dukart was the guy. I mean, he built this, and then sadly he passed away. Actually, on my 10th birthday, I was 10 years old. I turned 10 the day he passed away in November 19th, 1975. So Chick Lang from Pimlico Racecourse had this great quote in the Baltimore Sun in Dukart's obituary. He said he could open more doors to more important people in Baltimore than anybody else, if in doing so he could advance the cause of a worthwhile community activity. And so he had to build the team to Gerhardt's standards. And the first thing they decided to do is, let's go get Erwin Perassi out of the 115th Infantry Regiment, and let's get him to help us build this team. So this is the team. This is another team picture of them. So this is Irv Perassi, and from Chicago, Illinois. And Perassi, I found an oral interview he did in the Library of Congress, and he talked about being called in to coach this team. And then he talked about being chased around a field when he was looking for a patch of earth so they could practice. He went out to this German farm near Bremen and got chased by a German farmer with a knife. Yeah, so it was interesting oral interview. But Perassi was a first-generation American citizen. He spoke German, and ironically, all of his German relatives, and he had made trips before the war with his mother and father to Germany to visit his grandparents and aunts and uncles, and they all lived in Bremen, or the Bremen area, where Perassi was now part of the occupation forces of the U.S. Army. So that must have been really strange for him. He's a conqueror now, and he's conquered the neighborhood, basically, that his relatives live in. That had to have been bizarre. I would have loved to have asked him about that, but I obviously didn't get the chance. But he became the player manager. He was a football, basketball guy at Iowa, as an All-American. He also played baseball. He was the captain of their football team in 1939. They're called the Iron Men. They were ranked 9th in the nation. And that picture above him they're with the game ball from when they beat Notre Dame that year. And the guy on the right, Perassi's on the left in the Letterman's jacket. The guy on the right is Niall Kinnock. And if you go to Iowa today to a football game, you'll go to Kinnock Stadium. Niall Kinnock was the quarterback of that team. Parasi might have been the team captain, but Kinnock was the quarterback. And Niall Kinnock won the Heisman Trophy that year. He was the Heisman Trophy winner. He would go into the Navy. He would become an aviator. And then he would die in a plane crash at sea in 1943. And so Niall Kinnock is sort of like what Pat Tillman is to Arizona State University, the great Pat Tillman. Niall Kinnock is that to the University of Iowa and has been now for 80 years. And he was a very close friend of Parasi's. His death really impacted Parasi hard. But that's Parasi there. He was drafted by the Detroit Lions, but never really didn't want to play professional football. He wanted to play baseball. He signed with the Cardinals, and he went straight to Springfield, and he played with the Springfield Cardinals. And then after the military, he played professional basketball. So he was a D-Day +1 vet. He landed on June 7th on Omaha Beach. He received a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, and sadly, the Purple Heart ended his baseball career. So he was in January 1945, Parasi's leading a reconnaissance patrol across the Rohr River in Germany, and it was very foggy, and the Germans heard noise coming from the water, so they just opened up into the fog with MG-42 machine guns, and Parasi caught a bullet in his right arm. And his arm never really fully recovered from that. He couldn't get the arm strength back, and that pretty much did in his baseball career, but he did play on the 29th Division baseball team, and he was the manager. And that picture in the lower right hand, his daughter sent me that picture. She found it in his stuff. That's him. The back of the picture, he wrote in that picture that he did a triple in the game for the Bremen Enclave Championship that would advance them into the playoffs. And that was a picture that he had kept all these years. He was an insurance executive in Naperville, Illinois, outside of Chicago, and he had 10 children, 5 and 5, boys and girls, and then he passed away in 2005 at the age of 87. And so Parasi was the manager of the baseball team, a great guy, I'm told, and just, was an important part of this team. And then here's Don Calloway. Calloway was an infielder for the team, Blue Island, Illinois. Just like Parasi, Calloway was a first-generation American citizen whose parents were German. So, his World War II experience, his daughter, Karen, told me that it really impacted his view of Germany and Germans in general, all the things that he saw over there. And that's because he liberated a concentration camp with the 69th Division. That is a picture his daughter Karen sent to me of him. Don Calloway was a combat medic, and that's him walking past dead bodies in the Leipzig-Felka concentration camp, where German guards had literally just left and had murdered a bunch of concentration camp inmates right before the 69th Division rolled in to take the camp. He earned a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, and he had a very solid major league career. I mean, there's his stat line from Baseball Reference. You can see the 271 career batting average. More than 1,000 hits. Wasn't a power hit guy. He only had 29 home runs, but he had almost 4,000 at bats. Not a bad baseball player, and he missed a few years of his career. He was with the White Sox. Then they traded him to the Tigers, and then he tried to catch on at the tail end, but he was getting pretty old with the Philadelphia Athletics. He didn't last long with the Athletics. They cut him pretty early in the 1953 season, and then he went out west and he tried to play a few games for the Portland Beavers in the old Pacific Coast League. But it didn't work out well for him, and he came on back home and he settled down in Illinois. He is part of baseball history in two interesting incidents in baseball history. In 1947, Dizzy Dean was well past his career. He'd been retired for about 6 or 7 years at that point. And he probably should have retired after the 1938 World Series, but he didn't. He hung on way too long. And Dizzy was the color guy and a radio guy for the St. Louis Browns. Bill Veeck had Dizzy calling Browns games on the radio in St. Louis. And Dizzy Dean, the Browns were so bad that he would start telling, apparently as I read the story, he would start telling stories about all sorts of stuff during the middle of a broadcast because he just couldn't talk about the team. And he would tell Bill Veeck, oh, Mr. Veeck, what am I going to talk about? The team's really bad. Well, one day he really got on the Browns pitching staff, said they couldn't pitch a lick, got on him. And of course, if you know anything about Dizzy Dean, his grammar and his English wasn't great. It was very country. You know, he was not a super well-educated guy. And the Browns, the wives, the spouses of the Browns pitching staff got really irate. And they were giving Dizzy Dean 9 kinds of hell because he said on the air, I can still pitch better than the dang staff of the St. Louis Browns. And so the wives wanted him, you know, okay, buddy, put up or shut up. So Bill Veeck, always the showman, he got this idea. I'm gonna sign Dizzy Dean to a 1-day contract and put him on the mound and let's see what happens. And so he made the 1-game comeback. He threw 3 innings on September 28, 1947. The leadoff batter for the Detroit Tigers that day was Don Calloway, and Don Calloway got one of only 3 hits. I think Dizzy only gave up 3 hits in the game, and he didn't give up any runs. He actually, all things considered, pitched fairly well. Probably better than most of the Browns pitchers of that time. And then the second historical footnote that Calloway was a part of is he was with the Tigers when they faced the dwarf Eddie Goodell, when Bill Veeck sent the dwarf to bat on August 19th, 1951. So those are 2 interesting things in baseball history that Calloway was there for. After his career, he owned a restaurant and bar. He had 5 children with his wife Frances, a boy and 4 girls. And then very sadly, in 1964, during the birth of their 6th child, his wife Frances passed away, and the child also died. And he was left with some pretty young kids as a single father. He never remarried, but he continued to run his restaurant and bar. He had a lot of family in Blue Island that helped out with his kids. And he was just a stalwart in the community. He was really a beloved guy in the community of Blue Island. And when he died, it was like royalty in Blue Island had passed away. And he died, he was sitting in his chair, his favorite chair, watching golf on television, and just sitting in his chair. His daughter told me he had a heart attack, and that was it. And so that's Don Calloway. He was a big part of the 29th Division's team, and a big part of the reason it did so well. So Lloyd Whitey Moore was also a big part as the other Major League Baseball veteran on the team. He was from I have a hard time pronouncing this, but Tuscarawas, Ohio. He pitched in the majors for nearly 7 full seasons. He was at the Reds for almost all of it, and the Cardinals at the very end. There's his career stat line. He was a fireballing right-hander with speed that could match Bob Feller train of thought. Walter Johnson, excuse me. I mean, he was really a guy that could blow it by you. And that was very tantalizing. Branch Rickey thought this guy was going to be a future star and tried to sign him with the Cardinals, but the Reds beat him to it. Then the Yankees tried to buy Whitey Moore for $40,000 from the Reds, and the Reds wouldn't sell. They thought they had a future star on their hands. And he pitched in the 1939 World Series, and he retired 9 Yankees in a row. I think it was Game 3 that he pitched in, and he threw 3 innings, and he retired all 9 Yankees he faced and sat DiMaggio down. He retired DiMaggio even, and he did really well. And the umpire from that game, I've got this article where the home plate umpire of that game, whose name right now, I should have written it down, I can't remember, but he's quoted as saying that was the finest 3 innings that I saw pitched by any pitcher in the American League all season. Was pitched by Whitey Moore. I mean, that was really, it was the best 3 innings of pitching he ever saw. And that's what made Whitey so frustrating. He could pitch that well and then really blow himself up and walk a bunch of batters, lose control of a game. And then he pitched in the 40 World Series against the Detroit Tigers. That was a 7-game series. The Cincinnati Reds won that, as I'm sure most of you know. But Whitey only appeared in the 3 games the Reds lost. The Tigers won all 3 games, but he didn't give up any runs. He held the Tigers scoreless and did his job, and that he gave the Reds, if they could have gotten their offense together, a chance to catch up in those games. And he had a problem with alcohol, though, and that's what really hindered his career. Bill Weber told this story. He wrote a book. Bill Weber was the Reds' 3rd baseman, and he played for the Yankees for many years as well. And he's told this story about the Cardinals were coming to town. They were right on the Reds, nipping at their heels. The Reds were fighting for the pennant. And the night before a game, Whitey Moore goes out and gets liquored up and gets drunk and jumps in his car and drives his car and thought a railroad track was a road. And he drove his car on the tracks and then put the car in park and just sat there and went to sleep in his car. And the Cincinnati police found him there and got the car and got Whitey off the tracks right before a locomotive showed up. And then Bill McKechnie, the Reds manager, had to go bail him out of jail. And Bill Weber said that Whitey Moore was just a wonderful guy, but he didn't have a brain in his head. He was a clubhouse favorite. All of his teammates loved him, but he didn't have a brain in his head. And in researching Whitey, he had a problem with alcohol his whole life. I found articles where he was busted in Tuscawaras for drunken disorderlies and thrown in the clinker for a night or two to dry up. There were articles about him and his wife fighting. So I know he really struggled with the drink. But I think that there was a great career lost. And McKechnie, the Reds manager, really had a problem with Whitey as a pitcher because he said adversity would get into his head and he would outthink himself trying to get out of a difficult situation. And he would let an umpire or the crowd or an opponent really get in his head, and that he wasn't thinking. He would get angry on the mound. And McKechnie actually had to tell him one time, if you're an angry pitcher, you can't pitch for me. But anyway, Whitey also has an interesting historical footnote in baseball history. He pitched in the first major league games ever televised. So it was on August 26, 1939. It was the NBC affiliate in New York City. The game was broadcast to folks that were attending the World's Fair and about 400 households in the New York City area that had televisions. And it was a doubleheader. Whitey pitched in the second game. And these were the first Major League Baseball games ever televised, and he was a part of that. That's a pretty cool little footnote in history, other than the 2 World Series that he got to appear in. Served in the 69th Division and 20. He was a combat engineer, and then he became an assembler for a machine tool company in Ohio, and he passed away in 1987 at the age of 85. Joe Blaylock, and I've been going now for about 40 minutes. And so I might not get through all the players, but I can stop whenever you guys want me to stop, and I can take some questions. Just let me know. Or I can get through all the players real quick if you want. It's up to you guys. But Joe Blaylock is one of 3 primarily college football players that played on this team. He was Clemson University's first ever All-American in football, and he was a 2-time All-American. 1940 and 41, he was an end. He played in the Cotton Bowl. And I see there's something in the chat. Let me see what we got there. Oh, well. Oh, might as well finish the players. You bet. So, okay, we'll do that. Hang on a sec. Let me get back to where I was here. So there's Joe Blaylock. And so he was drafted by the Detroit Lions, just like Parasi was. Parasi was drafted by the Lions, but he didn't play like Parasi. He starred in baseball and basketball for Clemson, and he was an infantry officer. He was one of 2, along with Irv Parasi, one of 2 commissioned officers on the team. He was a platoon leader. He didn't have a long time in combat. He wasn't an almost D-Day veteran like Parasi was. He was a replacement officer, but he had a short and extremely difficult combat experience. He lost a lot of guys. And so basically what happened is he joined the 29th Division in, I think it was October of 1944, and they are getting ready to push into Germany. And the region of Germany where they were is flat as a pancake. The earth is flat as a pancake. And you can literally, and it's all these small villages linked by roads and farm fields. And, you could literally stand on the second floor of a farmhouse in one village and see a mile and a half away into the next village. And so if you were an infantry person and you were looking for some cover and some concealment, unless you were actually in the town, that was a very difficult thing to have. And so it was a tough piece of terrain to fight on. So Blaylock is at the replacement depot, and he doesn't yet know that he's going to get assigned to the 29th, and he runs into a Clemson buddy, a captain named Charles Shermer, who had graduated from Clemson a year before, maybe 2 years before Blaylock, and they knew each other from college. And so Shermer was waiting to be assigned too. He was a replacement officer. Blaylock was a replacement officer. So Shermer gets called forward first. He gets assigned to become a commander, brand new commander of an infantry company in combat. And he calls back and he has Blaylock assigned to him as well. So now Blaylock is one of his platoon leaders. And so they go out on a combat patrol just a few days after they get there together. And they get out into some open terrain, and all hell breaks loose. The German army, the 340th Volksgrenadier Division, opens up on them, and German snipers start to pick off these American soldiers. They kill Charles Schirmer. So Blaylock sees his buddy from Clemson get killed, and they're pinned down in this farmer's field. And if anyone moves, they get shot by a sniper. So you have to lay completely still, perfectly still, and just lay there, and they're waiting to be rescued. And the 29th Division is trying to get enough combat power to organize a rescue with artillery and everything else so they can get in there and they can get these guys out. And it took a few hours. And I think it was 17 or 18 guys got killed. He lost about 17 or 18 men, which is a little less than half of his platoon. And it happened right under his nose. He couldn't do anything about it. And then, of course, he had to serve out the rest of the war as an infantry officer. He continued to see harsh combat, but that very first experience really had a bad effect on Blaylock. I made contact with his son Alec, and Alec he had a couple of boys, and his son Alec is still down in South Carolina, and Alec told me that he didn't even know that his father played baseball in the Army. His dad never mentioned it. In fact, his dad never said anything about his military career. And I said, well, let me send you, my friend Joe Balkowski's written a 5-volume series on the 20th, and he specifically wrote about the combat action where your father's platoon was almost wiped out, and he saw so many die, including a friend of his from Clemson. And I Xeroxed those pages of Joe's book, and I emailed them to Alec, and he called me back the next day, and he said, well, I think now I understand why my father had problems with alcohol his entire life. No one knew. No one knew in the Blaylock family. His father had bottled it up. These guys didn't know what PTSD was. They didn't have all the support that we have today in the military, which still isn't enough, but it's a hell of a lot more than they had. And I think this haunted him for the rest of his life. And one of the things, he passed away from a respiratory ailment at the age of 55. And I wonder if respiratory ailment was code for alcoholism. I don't know. I didn't want to ask. I didn't feel like that was my place to ask. That's a private family matter. I would never write that in anything, but I wonder if that was the case. But the interesting note about his baseball career, he came back from World War II, and there was the minor league team nearby, and he was going to pharmacy school, was the Camden Chiefs. They were unaffiliated at the time. They were independent when Blaylock played for him. But he played minor league baseball for the Camden Chiefs, and he became close friends with Tommy Lasorda. And they were teammates for a season on the Camden Chiefs, and they really hit it off. They were both veterans, and Alec Blaylock, Joe Blaylock's son, told me that they became lifelong friends. And Tommy Lasorda, before he would go to spring training in Florida every year, because he had met and married a woman from South Carolina, Lasorda used to swing through South Carolina on the way to Florida, and he would always visit the Blaylocks. And when he became the manager of the Dodgers, and of course, I think by that time, Joe Blaylock had passed away, because it was a couple of years later that Lasorda became the Dodgers manager. He would always have them if they played the Atlanta Braves, he would have them to Atlanta, and they would come see the Braves and visit with Tommy Lasorda. And Lasorda was a family friend of the Blaylocks. And I thought that was a really neat story. And another kind of cool point in history. All of these guys have something interesting about them. That's one of the things that it makes this story of this military baseball team compelling to me. There's a very human element to it, and there's all these little neat, poignant historical footnotes that these guys are involved in. But that's Joe Blaylock. Wilfred Cale, a two-sport high school phenom from Charlotte, North Carolina, baseball and football. He was the quarterback of his high school football team. He looks like an accountant. He looks like a software developer or something like that. He doesn't. You look at those pictures, he's got the round glasses, and he doesn't look like a baseball player, but he was apparently a hell of a player. And he was from a very wealthy, prominent Charlotte area family that owned a company called Cale Office Outfitters. They sold office furniture. And he attended Duke, and he lettered for 3 years in varsity baseball at Duke. And then right after he graduated from Duke, he played briefly for the Durham Bulls. He signed with the Dodgers. And in that, when he was with Durham, he got to play against Ted Williams and the Cloudbuster Nine, which also had Johnny Pesky and Johnny Sain on the team. And that was on June 18th, 1943. And the newspaper article about the game said that the ex-Duke shortstop fields brilliantly, and then he went 1 for 3 at the plate against Pre-Flight, so he had a great game. One of the things that I find compelling about Cale is he probably could have easily gone in as a commissioned officer and been a lieutenant or a captain, and he chose not to do that. Even though he had money, his family had money, probably had influence. He went in as an enlisted man into the infantry, rose to become a staff sergeant, earned 2 Bronze Stars. One of the Bronze Stars was for valor, Combat V. He earned a Purple Heart, and he elected not to return to baseball after the war. He got into the family business, which he ran the family business at one point, and then he passed. He had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. His son is a professor, might be retired by now, but his son is a professor at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. And then he passed away in March of 1983 at the age of 62. Lefty Howard. Now, this guy to me is the enigma of the team. So he was born in Augusta, Georgia, lived there as a kid, but then moved to Greenville, South Carolina, and he was a pitcher on the team. And he played from 1934 to 43 and then 46 to 45 in the South Carolina textile leagues. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know much about the textile leagues until I did this project. But these all, South Carolina was home to this really unbelievable textile industry. And a lot of clothing and fabric was made in South Carolina. It was kind of like the fabric and clothing headquarters of the United States. And the industry was huge. And but a lot of these mills were in small towns. And the folks that owned these mills didn't want to lose workers. And if you're living in this boring little small town, your workers could get poached or go somewhere else once they develop their craft. And so they came up with activities and amenities in the town to try to keep people rooted there. And one of the things they built was baseball teams. So this entire network of baseball teams got built by these, Brandon Mill had a team, Woodside Mill had a team. I mean, it just went on and on and on. And that's where Lefty Howard pitched. And I'm reading about him, and then I'm reading that, that I'll go to my very bottom bullet. For the 29th Division baseball team in game 1 of the ETO semifinals, he dueled Ewell the Whip Blackwell from the Cincinnati Reds. Blackwell was a 6'6" pitcher with a sidearm delivery. Roy Campanella, the Hall of Fame catcher from the Brooklyn Dodgers, Campanella said that Blackwell was the toughest pitcher he faced in all of his years in Major League Baseball. And that was in his book, his memoirs. Blackwell was something else, and he threw a 2 or 3 hitter against the 29th Division in game 1 of the ETO semifinals. But here, this little 5'11" pitcher from the South Carolina Textile Leagues throws a 5 hitter in that same game and lost 2-1. I had to look it up and pull it out. The 71st Infantry Division, who the 29th was playing in that game, they had 14 players on their roster, 14 with Major League Baseball experience. Ken Heinzelman, Blackwell, of course, Herb Brimmer, Maurice Van Robes, Harry Walker, I think from the Cardinals. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. I mean, that was a fully professional baseball team. There were no high school players or college kids on that team. And Lefty Howard dueled this guy one-on-one for 9 innings and damn near won the game. And so I thought, well, how would a guy that good never pitch in the major leagues? I mean, he had to have had a chance, and it took me a long time to find it. But he was signed in 1937 for the 38 season. He was signed by the Yankees, and he was going to get put in Augusta to their affiliate in Augusta, Georgia. And 1938, he didn't show up. He just didn't show up. So they suspended him. They didn't know where he was. They couldn't get him to come to Augusta. 1939, it was the same thing. There's articles in newspapers that talk about this. He was suspended for refusing to report. And then all of a sudden in 1940, he didn't report again. And he voluntarily retired from professional baseball or from the major leagues without ever having thrown a pitch in either major league or minor league baseball. Yet he absolutely, it appears, had the ability to pitch at that level. He apparently had great breaking stuff, and he was really crafty. Maybe like John Means from the Orioles. You know, John Means is one of those guys. He's not going to overpower you. Of course, he's on the bench now with his Tommy John, but he's not going to overpower you. But he you know, he could really dominate you with great breaking stuff, and that's what it sounds like Lefty Howard was. And so I found articles. He worked as a railroad engineer supporting a railroad that took supplies all around North Carolina for the textile industry. And then he was a textile league pitcher, but apparently he was like a mercenary in the textile league. I think he played for like every team in the textile. It was unbelievable. And it seemed like he would just go wherever the highest bidder was, and that's where he would play. And I found an article in a South Carolina newspaper that said he was making $100 a game, win or lose, pitching in the South Carolina textile leagues. That was big money in the 1930s and 40s. So he made excellent money as a railroad engineer. He made even more money as a textile league pitcher. And then I found in those 29th Division newspapers in the profile that they profiled him that he met his wife, her name was Gladys, and he was domesticated. He wanted family life, and he wanted to be stable, and he wanted to put down roots. And he said he didn't want the pressures of being a Major League Baseball player, but he had a chance. He could have done it, and he didn't. And I'm going to always wonder, boy, what would have happened if Lefty Howard had gone into the professional ranks and played ball? And the interesting note is because he lived in Greenville, South Carolina, and he was in the Textile League, and he was friends with Shoeless Joe Jackson. They were pretty good buds. Shoeless Joe was friends with a lot of those guys in the Textile Leagues, particularly the guys that spent time with Brandon Mill or Greenville. And Brandon Mill was in Greenville, and then there was the Greenville Spinners as well. But yeah, he knew Joe Jackson pretty good, and that's a kind of a neat thing. But he's the enigma on the team to me. I'll always wonder, you know, what could Lefty Howard have been if he'd have given professional baseball a shot? Ken Hess, Queens, New York, all-state baseball player from Stuyvesant High School. He was a powerhouse player at Syracuse University, primarily a first baseman. He had a lot of home runs. There's some stories in different newspapers around Syracuse where he had some walk-offs, and they had a pretty good club at Syracuse, and he was a good player. Right after he left Syracuse, he got drafted into the Army. He went into the finance corps. He majored in business, and he went into the finance corps. And at that time, the finance corps, their school for the Army was at Wake Forest University. They'd moved it there for World War II, and they were teaching the finance courses for Army finance in a university setting. And then they had intramural sports teams, and he played on the finance school football team, finance school basketball team, baseball team, and he was an excellent player. And then he did get to play. There was a war bond drive game to raise money for the war effort in Rocky Mount with the minor league team in Rocky Mount, South Carolina. And they had sent Johnny Pesky and Johnny Sain over to join that minor league team and kind of be a draw to get some people to come to the game to see these major league players. And then Ken Hess played against him in a doubleheader, and he went 1 for 8 that day and got to play against the Cloudbuster, a couple of Cloudbuster 9 players. He didn't get to face Ted Williams or play against Ted Williams, but he did pay. And he served as a paymaster, and he earned a Bronze Star. A paymaster, by the way, is kind of a crazy job. You know, back in the days, you could get paid cash in the Army. And I mean, believe it or not, they didn't pay you in cash when I first joined in the 80s in the military, but they would hand you a check. And they'd have the checks in a strong box, and the unit first sergeant or unit senior NCO would come out, and they'd open up that box, and they'd hand you your check. But back then they would pay in cash too. And so he was a paymaster. He would go around even right up to the front lines, not even far from combat, and he would pay guys. And so he had a sidearm with him and a couple of guards, and he carried a strong box with a bunch of cash in it, and he would pay soldiers right there on the battlefield. And that's what he did. And then after the war, he went to work for Pan American Airways up in New York City for 37 years. His wife, Dorothy, had 2 daughters. One of them I've talked to extensively, Deborah Sharkey. She sent me some of these pictures, by the way. I'll tell you about that in a sec. And he stayed involved with youth baseball all of his life. He was a legend in a little league up there, the Whitestone Little League in Queens, New York. He always loved baseball and stayed connected to it in some way, but he just never played professionally. And he was I wish I'd known in 2016, I would have hauled my butt up there to try to talk to him. He died at the age of 95 in 2016, right around the time I found out the 29th Division had a baseball team after VE Day. So Ken Hess's daughter is responsible for another lucky break I got on the way. Now I'm going to talk about the Mexican-American guy again that was on the team. I had spent a lot of hours, it seemed like days, trying to figure out who this guy was. I was going through those morning reports, searching every Mexican-American or every Mexican surname I could find: Lopez, Rodriguez, Martinez, I mean, you name it. And I learned that a lot of Mexican-Americans served in the 29th Division, but I wasn't any closer to knowing who our guy was, my guy. And there's 3 pictures of him. And so I'm talking to Deborah Sharkey on the phone. I'm doing parallel research on these guys, and I'm talking to her about her dad. And she mentions to me that she's got pictures that he kept of the 29th Division baseball team, and she'd be happy to send them to me. And she told me, she says, and you can even keep the pictures. And I said, Deborah, I can't keep your family history. Yeah, I just can't do that. But I said, if you send them to me, I can make high resolution scans and I can send them back to you. So she did. And so a few days later, this package arrives from New York City. Deborah's still lives in Queens, where she grew up. She's a retired New York City school teacher. And I get this manila envelope with all these pictures in it. And in that picture on the far right, Ken Hess wrote on the back of that picture, Ortega, Hess, and Kale, roommates on the trip, August 1945. So that was when they played the 71st Division for the championship of Germany. And my Mexican-American player's last name was Ortega. And I'm like, holy cow, I couldn't believe it. I was on cloud 9 for about 2 weeks after I learned that. It was such a relief to know who he was. And I wanted to know his story. And lo and behold, I was able to get it. So George Ortega was from San Antonio, Texas. He was a catcher. He was an elite baseball player from Brackenridge High School, class of 1930. Brackenridge High School is still open today. It's the oldest high school in San Antonio. If you want to invoke a name from a Brackenridge High alumnus who's guaranteed to irritate a Baltimore Orioles fan, particularly one that was an Orioles fan in the early 90s, Cito Gaston, the old Blue Jays manager, is an alumnus of Brackenridge High School. So George Ortega went to Brackenridge, and then after he graduated, he played semi-pro ball in a thing called the Texas Span Am League for several years. Very similar to the South Carolina Textile Leagues, very similar setup, except local businesses in San Antonio and the Valley, McAllen, Del Rio, those towns, Laredo, they all had these teams in the Span Am League. And they would be, the teams would be, El Phoenix Butchers and Bell Taxi and, Fred's Grocery Store and Joe's Bar and Grill. And they would have these teams and they would organize them, and you would sign, believe it or not, you'd sign a contract that you would play with one team. And then you were usually paid in some form of barter, I found out. Like, you could get free taxi rides if you played for Bell Taxi, or you'd get 20% off your groceries if you played for Bell Grocery Store or whatever it was, or whatever the name of the store was. El Phoenix Butchers, you'd get money off your meat. And occasionally these guys also got some cash, but that's what they did. George was so competitive. There was another semi-pro league in Texas, and he was playing for that league while he was under contract to the Span Am League. This was before World War II, and he got caught and he got suspended from the Span Am League for several years. But he was one of the best players year in and year out in San Antonio. I tracked down his son, George Ortega Jr., through his grandniece, or let me see, it would have been his great grandniece. I found a woman named Margaret Lichtig. Her maiden name was Gonzalez. And she was the grandniece of George Ortega, and she is a retired United States Secret Service agent. And I was going down to San Antonio a lot because the company I worked for before Sinclair, it was a government contractor, and I had a government contract with an Air Force organization that was based in San Antonio, and I was making trips to San Antonio a lot. And I lived in Texas for 12 years, and I went to Texas State University, which is right up the road from San Antonio, about 30 miles. And so I was down there all the time, and I actually got a chance to meet Margaret, and then she hooked me up with George Ortega Jr., her cousin. I got a lot of great information about George Sr. And one of the things that George Ortega Jr. told me is he played against Dizzy Dean. So Dizzy Dean, when he was in the Army in the 20s, he was at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. and he was playing on an Army club at Fort Sam Houston. And when he got discharged, there was a league called the San Antonio Municipal League, and Dizzy went and pitched in the Municipal League, and that's where the Cardinals found him and signed him. But George also played in the Municipal League as well, and he played against Dizzy Dean. And then I've tried to this next bullet is George Jr. told me this, so this is anecdotal. I don't have a newspaper clipping of it. I've tried to validate this or verify it. I'm not saying that George Jr. wasn't telling me the truth. I'm sure he thinks this absolutely was the truth. And maybe it was. I don't know. I hope it was, because it's really cool. He apparently caught Satchel Paige during one of Paige's barnstorming visits to San Antonio when Satchel was out barnstorming in the 1930s. And then he was invited to this Hank Severide baseball camp. Hank Severide was a major league catcher for several teams. He managed the AA San Antonio Missions, and he would have this baseball camp in San Marcos, Texas, where my alma mater, Texas State, is located. And in 1934, I found a newspaper article that listed all the players that were invited to Hank Severide's baseball camp. You couldn't get an invite unless you were considered to be somebody that had the ability to play in the professional ranks. And he did attend that camp. George Ortega attended that camp, but nothing came of it. And I don't know why. But I know that he went to the camp and that he was invited. So he got drafted into the Army. He joined the 175th Infantry on August 6, 1944, right as the unit was attacking a town called Vire, France. And he served as an infantry guy. And then the war ended, and he was on the 29th Division baseball team. After the war, he owned a couple of taverns. He owned an aircraft painting business, a small area paint your general aviation aircraft, your Cessna or your Piper airplane. Down at Kelly Field, what became Kelly Air Force Base. And he owned this thing called Ortega's Ice House. It was a billiard parlor and a tavern, and he sponsored a baseball team. By now he's in his 40s, and he's put on some weight, and he decided to call his team Ortega's Fat and 40. And so George Jr. told me you had to meet 3 criteria to make the team. You had to be fat, you had to be over 40, but you still had to be able to play baseball. So maybe I envision, 12 or 15 Alejandro Kirks running around there, the Blue Jays catcher or something like that. But he's not 40, but guys like that were fat and could play baseball. And they had a pretty good team. And the San Antonio Express News and San Antonio Light would run articles about Ortega's Fat and 40 all the time. In fact, I've got a ton of articles that I plucked out of San Antonio newspapers about George Ortega and his baseball career in the San Antonio area. He had one son, George Jr., and a daughter with his wife, Diego, and sadly, he passed away from colon cancer on May 29th, 1979, at age 67. I actually got to visit his grave. Margaret, his grandniece, took me to his graveside at the National Cemetery at Fort Sam Houston. I got a great picture of me kneeling by his grave with my Baltimore Orioles jacket on, and that was a big honor to go see his grave. So George Ortega's story didn't disappoint me at all. I'm so glad that I know who he is, and that I'm able to tell his story and let other people hear it too. It's a great story. So there's Earl Gelf, who gave us a lot of these pictures, of course, and he was from DeSoto, Wisconsin. Pitched in the Semi-Pro Scenic League, which was later changed to called the Northwest Iowa League in 41 and 42. Gets drafted into the Army, serves in the 271st Infantry in the 69th Division. Came back from the war. He didn't have a baseball seat to land in, and so he played in an amateur league in La Crosse, Wisconsin, called the Lacrosse Baseball Association. And he was he was trying to invent himself as a utility player. As I understand it, he was pitching for the 29th Division's team, but Don Calloway told him, "You're never going to make it in the pros as a pitcher, but you hit the ball pretty good, and maybe you can make it as a utility infielder or an outfielder, some sort of utility player." And so he was trying to reinvent himself like that. And he's hitting in this amateur league, which was apparently a pretty competitive league, like 546 when the White Sox actually signed him, probably at Don Calloway's recommendation, and he was sent to the Superior Blues. But he struggled with the Superior Blues. He didn't hit well. He hit well under 200, and he only played in a handful of games. I think Superior was Class C, so he struggled, and he got sent down to Class D ball in Mattoon, Illinois, with the Mattoon Indians, and he hit even worse there, like maybe a $115. And after about 46 games in the minor leagues, he was done. His footnote in history, and remember I told you so many of these guys have a footnote in history, in baseball history. He was a teammate of Rogers Hornsby's son with Mattoon in 1949, Bill Hornsby. There's his career, hit 185 over 17 games in Mattoon. That's when he was released. I think his career batting average between Superior and Mattoon was even worse than 185. But he only played in 17 games with the Mattoon Indians. And he went back to DeSoto, Wisconsin, and he owned a sporting goods store that he still owned when he died, and that's where they had his funeral. His funeral was held in his family sporting goods store, and he served on the DeSoto, Wisconsin school board. And then he and his wife had 5 children, 2 boys and 3 girls. One of those boys, of course, owned the strip club, and he passed away on May 4th, 2008 at the age of 83. Earl Dothinger, this guy was a really good pitcher. He was from Pleasant Mountain, Illinois, signed by the Cardinals in the Arkansas-Missouri League. He was only 17 years old when he made his professional debut. And then from 1940 to 43, he was with the Springfield Cardinals, and he played with his future 29th Infantry Division teammate, Irv Perossi. Perossi went from the University of Iowa to the Springfield Cardinals and played with the Cardinals. So Perossi and Dothinger knew each other before they ever went into the Army. Then he got lost. There was a reshuffle of the Cardinals minor league system, and he kind of got lost in that shuffle, and he got drafted into the Army anyway. So he kind of, had to disrupt his baseball career, as so many guys did. He was an infantryman with the 175th Infantry Regiment. He was in Cannon Company at the headquarters of the 175th. So that would have been like mortars, artillery, indirect fire. And then in 1946, after the Army, he goes down to Houston in the Texas League, back with the Cardinals. He's with the Houston Buffaloes for 2 months. And then he was sold to the Shreveport Sports, which were affiliated at the time with the White Sox. And he spent 1946 and 48 with Shreveport. But not long after he got to Shreveport, he throws a no-hitter against his old team, against Houston. But he started having arm trouble in 1948, and it effectively ended his career. But he kept playing. I mean, but he wasn't never the same pitcher. But he actually, the Cardinals must, and I can't remember this guy's name, but there was a doctor in the 20s and 30s. He saw Ty Cobb when Ty Cobb had arm issues, and he saw Babe Ruth. He was kind of like the Frank Jobe or James Andrews, James Andrews, who a lot of the athletes go. He was kind of like one of those guys of his day. And when Dothinger's arm brought up, they brought him up to St. Louis, and he saw this doctor that was basically the Cardinals team doctor. And they gave him some kind of injections, and they did some stuff, and his arm improved a little bit, but it never really returned to what it was. And he just kept getting sent down. He went from Shreveport to the Alexandria Aces of the Evangeline League. And he was there for the remainder of 1948. Then he started 49 in Alexandria, managed to throw another no-hitter. Of course, this is pretty low-level minor league ball, but he was sent down even further, and he goes to Class B, Anniston, Alabama, and he played briefly for a guy named Bill Seal Jr. Well, Bill Seal Jr., I'm about to cover him in one of these slides. Bill Seal was his teammate on the 29th Division baseball team. So he played with Perossi at Springfield, and then played with another of his 29th Division teammates, Bill Seal Jr. in Anniston, Alabama. He had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, with his wife Doffeline, and he passed away in 1994 at the age of 74. So Bob Lansinger, this is our lone Marylander and our Baltimore guy that was on the team. Bob was a big guy, about 6'3". He went to Mount St. Joe's High School, class of 1940. And he was an outfielder and pitcher. And in high school, the boy, I found some Baltimore Sun articles about him. He had some prodigious home runs. I mean, he was a big guy and a big hitter. And so the Orioles, the International League Orioles, signed him and sent him to Class D Tarboro in 41. And then he got to appear in a single game in 41 with the International League Orioles. And I guess they were impressed, but they tried to turn him into a full-time pitcher. Now, he'd only been a position player in high school and in Tarboro. He was a position player, and they get him up here in the spring training in 1942, and they try to turn him in, because he's got a big arm, into a pitcher, and he got released. He couldn't make the conversion to being a professional baseball pitcher. At least not one that was dependable enough they're willing to put him on the mound. And then he was sold to the Lancaster Red Roses for the 42 season. And I believe the Red Roses were a Philadelphia Phillies affiliate. And he was also with another team briefly that I think was Philadelphia A's. But by the end of the 1942 season, his professional stint was basically over. He was drafted into the Army, served in the 116th Infantry Regiment, joined his unit in August of 1944 as a replacement. He was never wounded. Came back home to Baltimore, married his sweetheart, Virginia, worked at W.R. Grace and Company for 32 years and retired. He was an avid Orioles fan. He's actually buried right out here in a cemetery right down the road from me. I live in Woodstock, Ellicott City area. And if you go down Old Frederick Road, 99, Press Lawn, I think, is the name of the cemetery, and he's buried in there. He passed away on December 21st, 2010. He was 85. I've talked to his grandson and his daughter. And yeah, so he sounded like he was a neat guy, but unfortunately his professional career never panned out. But that picture in the upper right-hand corner is a picture I plucked out of the Baltimore Sun where it said, hometown rookie getting a shot with the Orioles. And that's when they were trying to turn him into a pitcher. Jim Robinson, interesting guy here, Tacoma, Washington. He was an infielder, signed by the St. Louis Browns in 39 by a scout named Jack Fournier, who had been the head baseball coach at UCLA and also had a Major League Baseball career. And he played for 4 clubs in 3 seasons. For one of them, I think it was Elmira, New York, he had a 29-game hitting streak. And then he gets drafted into the Army, goes to the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division, serves in the infantry, serves in the war, plays in the baseball team, comes back and starts 1947 with the San Antonio Missions, but he gets sent down. But before he ever got to the Missions, he got into a spat at spring training with the St. Louis Browns. So by now, Jack Fournier is the head scout, and he's moved up to St. Louis, and he's now the head scout for the organization, not just the West Coast scout. And they apparently, according to an interview that Robinson gave a newspaper, they brought like 400 players to spring training that year in 1947. There were so many players that Brown said, I couldn't get the work I needed to get in to get ready for the season. And I was promised that I would get a fair shot to advance my career. And I was denied that because these bumbling idiots in the Browns front office basically, invited 400 players to camp. And he was really upset about that. And his tenure in San Antonio actually started off hitting really well, but his batting average went down. The team was bad. The manager got fired mid-season, and then he became a casualty. He got sent down, and he went up to Elmira, New York, Gloversville, Johnstown, I think was where he went. And then he got into he had some kind of pissing contest with a newspaper columnist in some small town up there who was really on him pretty good about his stint in San Antonio. I guess that there was an allegation that he claimed that the San Antonio Mission sent him down and he was batting well over 300. So what I did to see if that claim was valid is I downloaded out of the San Antonio newspapers every box score and all of the season stats that I could compile for him. And I basically forensically recreated his stats for the first, 9 weeks of the 1947 baseball season. And yes, he started off red hot and he was hitting well over 300, but he was probably hitting, I can't remember the exact number, but it's about 228 by the time the San Antonio Mission sent him down, and his batting average was heading down. So it was a bit of an exaggeration on his part, but he did not leave the Browns organization a happy camper. He ends up in the Western International League with Vancouver, heading back over to the West Coast, played for a couple more teams in that league, and actually briefly player managed a team in the Western International League. And then he retired in 1954, and he became a high school teacher and baseball coach in the Seattle area. He was a good one. And then he became an MLB scout, and he scouted on his scout card that I downloaded. He scouted for Oakland and Kansas City, Atlanta, Chicago, and briefly it looks like the Orioles on the West Coast. And then his son Mike was drafted, and maybe somebody can tell me what this is. I don't know what this is, but he was drafted, and I found the newspaper article. Mike, who had never played in the majors, he played junior college baseball. He was drafted out of a junior college in the Seattle area. His son Mike was drafted in the 1973 Major League Baseball free agent draft by the Milwaukee Brewers. So I don't know what the free agent draft was. I maybe guys that weren't affiliated or had never been signed by a major league team or one of their affiliates. But his son Mike had a very brief minor league career. He also didn't make it. And then Jim and his wife Isabel had 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, and he passed away of a stroke at the age of 78 in 2001. Jack Dobratz was one of the high school players on the team. He was from Port Huron, Michigan, big guy, 6'3". He was the best schoolboy athlete in Port Huron, Michigan. I mean, man, he was in the newspapers all the time. And during his senior year, he threw a couple no-hitters on his varsity baseball team. So the Reds, spring training, I guess during the war in 43 and 44, a lot of these Major League Baseball teams really couldn't travel to the South. So they had spring training. The Reds had spring training in Bloomington, Indiana. And I can't imagine that was a pleasant spring training. It must have been pretty cold. But Dobratz got to spend his week of spring break with the Reds in Indiana at their camp. And then he got drafted into the Army right after graduation. But he thought when he got out of the Army, he was going to have a place with the Reds. And he thought that the Reds had talked about sending him to Syracuse. And he actually told a military journalist that I plan to go to Syracuse and play for Syracuse in the Cincinnati Reds organization. But that was never meant to be. It didn't happen. Jack was a pioneer in the 115th Infantry Regiment. A pioneer was what we would in the Army today call a sapper, a demo engineer, basically, a guy that would blow up obstacles and stuff like that. And he was a D-Day vet. He landed on D-Day. He had 2 Bronze Stars. But he never got wounded. I mean, how he landed on D-Day and didn't get hit at least once, I'll never know. But he didn't. And then like I said, he thought he would return home to the Reds with that minor league deal. Played basketball and baseball in the semi-pro leagues in Michigan, but he got trench foot really bad in November of 44 and spent several weeks in the hospital with trench foot. And his son, I made contact with his son, and his son told me that he had problems with his feet his entire life. So I don't know how good he was in baseball and basketball in these semi-pro leagues. He was still pretty young. But he said that he didn't last very long doing that because of the problems with his feet. He married a war widow. His wife, her husband was a bomber pilot, B-24 Liberator bomber pilot who got shot down in the China-Burma-India theater or crashed or something. And he met wife. She had a little girl, so he adopted this little girl. And he worked in horticulture and woodworking for Gibson Guitars. He had a degree from Western Michigan in horticulture. And he had the one adopted child and then his biological son. And then Jack Dobratz passed away on September 29th, 1989 at the age of 66. Bill Seal Jr., I told you I would tell you about Bill Seal Jr. And he was from Tulsa, Oklahoma, a career minor league player. And wow, boy, it's almost 9 o'clock. And Memphis Chicks, traded to the Pirates, bounced, did a whole bunch of stuff, but you can look at that stuff. But he managed a guy in 1949. He was the player manager of the Carrollton Hornets in Georgia. And he managed a baseball player named Neil Oliver Russell for 11 games in 1949. And Russell got hit in the head a couple of times with pitches. He got hit in the head and he missed some games. He recovered, he came back and got hit in the head again, like right off the bat. And he missed a bunch of games. And Russell decided, rather than get hit in the head, I'm going to retire from professional baseball. Neil Oliver Russell was a college graduate, a Navy veteran. He'd gone to Dartmouth College, and he is better known as Bing Russell. And he went out to Hollywood after he left the Carrollton Hornets and went to Hollywood. And in 1949, he was done. And his son, Kurt Russell, is the actor Kurt Russell. And he raised a pretty good baseball playing son who made it into the minors. And then he goes on to become the founder of the Portland Mavericks, the independent league, the Maverick, that great documentary, The Battered Bastards of Baseball, is about. Anyway, but Bill Seal ends up with the St. Petersburg Saints. He retired at the end of the 53 season, car salesman, worked for a beverage distributorship with his wife, Rosemary, and he passed away, a boy and a girl, passed away in 83 at the age of 64. I got 3 more players to go. Teddy Waiter, high school player, lettered in baseball for Trenton High School. He got on a hot streak playing for the 29th Division artillery team. That's how he made the division's all-star team. He received a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart and had one son, Anna, with his wife, Anna Mae. And after the war, he never played professionally. After the war, he worked as a toll collector for the Delaware River Toll Bridge Commission. And he was in 1957, he was part of a group of 7 toll collectors that got nailed for pocketing tolls, and they got fired from their jobs. And I don't think they were charged criminally, but they were fired from their jobs, and then they got publicly shamed in a newspaper article that I found. And then he passed away on November 20th, 1965. He was young. He passed away at the age of 41. So who knows what happened there. I've tried to reach out to his relatives who I've located, but they don't respond. So I don't know if I'll ever be able to tell the whole story of Teddy Waiter. Mitch Grissom, he was from Tupelo, Mississippi. He was an outfielder, 4-sport letterman at Ole Miss, track, baseball, football, and basketball. He played in the 1936 Orange Bowl. It was Ole Miss's first ever bowl appearance. Played for the Paducah Indians of the Class D Kitty League. He was said to be in the fastest player in the Class D Kitty League. I found some articles where they had some kind of skills competition at one time in the Kitty League, and I guess sprinting or making it down to first base. And Grissom, who ran college track, was the fastest player in the league. And Grissom was a big guy. He was like 6'2", 6'3". Became a high school teacher and coach after World War II. He also served 3 years as a county sheriff in Mississippi. He was inducted into the Mississippi High School Coaches Hall of Fame in 1975. He had a couple state championships under his belt in different sports. And interestingly, he's a lifelong bachelor who never got married, and he passed away November 12th, 1973 at the age of 62. And my last player, who I just recently identified, Mitch Grissom I also just recently identified, was Jim Douglas from Toledo, Ohio. He's a catcher. Before the war, he was a Scranton, Memphis, and Roanoke Red Sox minor league teams. He didn't play too many games with them. And then he gets drafted into the Army. 46 and 48 with Durham, Spartanburg, and Dayton Cleveland Indians affiliated teams. He hit 308 for his minor league baseball career in 522 plate appearances, 178 games. I mean, that's a pretty good sampling, but he whatever happened, he couldn't advance. And so he ended up saying, the hell with it, I'm going to go to college. And he went to the University of Dayton and picked up a Bachelor of Arts, and then went to Miami, Ohio, and picked up a master's degree. And he became an elementary school teacher and principal for more than 20 years. And then he coached the JV basketball team at the University of Dayton, but then also coached the varsity baseball team at the University of Dayton for a little while. And he's a member of the Dayton, Ohio Amateur Baseball Hall of Fame, and he had 2 sons and a daughter with his wife, Effie. And in 1986, on April Fool's Days in Montreal, his daughter had moved to Montreal, and he was visiting, and he had a stroke, and he died at the age of 62 in 1986. And that's the 29th Division team. All the players that I have identified, I know it was a long talk. There's a look. All the players in green are the players that I talked about here. Anybody with red with unknown in their names is somebody I have not been able to identify yet positively. I have a lead on the guy that's second from the left sitting, but I'm not sure that lead's going to pan out. But there's the 18 or 20 players, and then the other thing is the coverage of these teams, the coverage of these games was really uneven. I know they played a lot more games than this, but these are the only games that I can find mentions in the Stars and Stripes or the division's newspaper on that they actually played in. But they had more than that. And I'm still trying to figure out, where I might be able to get more information on the games that were played. But that's what I have on what they played, and that's my story. And I can take any questions. Of course, you're the last of the Mohicans, Peter.
Yeah, which is interesting. There's no games locally, so. Are you going to be in Minneapolis?
When that's the SABR conference, right?
The convention, yeah.
When is that?
Next week, the 7th.
Oh, no. Unfortunately, I'm not. Yeah, I would love to go to one of those. SABR, I know, has got their headquarters out at Arizona State University. And my son is going to be a freshman at Arizona State. We're taking him out in a couple of weeks. He's going to start college.
Good.
He's going to ASU, so I may try to link up with the SABR headquarters and see what that's all about. I know it's in the Cronkite School of Journalism out there.
Yeah, I don't know how many people actually work out of headquarters, since we're a remote world these days.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, my grandfather was my mother's father was in the 29th. I think he was the 109th Regiment. And he was landed on Omaha Beach, and Bronze Star, Purple Heart winner.
Wow.
So I found this particularly interesting. So
Oh, well, shoot me his name and I can look him up in the morning reports, and see what might be in the morning reports about him. If he was a
yeah,
Purple Heart recipient, there should be a notation about him being wounded. The
yeah.
morning reports are generally very accurate, but they're not infallible. These were reports done by people, and occasionally they miss stuff. But
Oh yeah, yeah, I'll email you his name, his birth date, and everything.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
um, but yeah, I appreciate it. This was different. We always hear on the classic players or franchises or some
yeah.
minor league team somebody forgot, but this was so I appreciate your service, Colonel. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're quite welcome, and I enjoyed it. And I'm going to keep rolling on this, and I'm happy to, someday if anyone wants to hear more about it or want me to give that pitch again, I'm happy to do it. Just let me know.
Absolutely. And if you get to the point of publication or whatnot, we'd love to host you at since you're local,
Yeah,
um, at
yeah,
the museum somewhere down the line.
yeah.
Um,
Are you there every day at the Babe Ruth Museum?
no, that's my part-time gig. So
Okay, you were. Oh wait, you work at a law firm, right?
I did. I got downsized at
Oh,
the beginning of June. So I've been looking, shall we say.
okay.
Um, you know, yeah, I'll be getting back in soon because I can't, you know, can't
Yeah.
live on on minuscule amounts of food forever.
All right. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Wow. Are you a paralegal or a lawyer? What do you?
Yes, not by choice, but by default. And I went to college in DC, so I've done it for many years. I would love to, and I'm trying to not go back into a private firm, but more into in-house, like a big company.
Okay. Okay.
So um, I also would love to work for the Orioles if the Mr. Rubenstein would give me a call. I'd be there in a heartbeat.
Oh
So,
my God. You call Bill Stetka.
he doesn't have as much clout.
No, I
Um,
know. I know that he doesn't, but he might be away. I did my brother and I when I retired from the army, my kind of bucket list thing that I wanted to do was Oriole Dream Week.
oh,
And I did the last Oriole Dream Week before COVID hit in January 2020. It's the most fun I ever had. I just had an absolute blast. What I don't tell people is I didn't go straight into the Army. I don't know if you remember, I don't know how long you've been in Baltimore, but I actually came up here and I was part of the sports team at Fox 45.
okay.
I worked with Bruce Cunningham, and I don't know if you remember a guy Max Morgan and some other guys worked there. And from January of 92 to January or to December of 95, I was with Fox 45. And then I came back and freelanced. I got mobilized with a National Guard unit and sent to Bosnia. And then I basically I returned to full-time Army duty after that deployment and never looked back. Um, so I knew Stetka from my TV days, and I know that the regime has changed though, and I know Bill can be interesting, but he's a friend, and you never know, he might have something.
Yeah, I'll definitely pitch out to him too. He's helped us for many years. He always gets us an Orioles alum for our various meetings.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so
yeah. When
he,
I was on a team in Dream Week coached by Jeff Tackett, Mike Bordick, and Alan Mills, and boy was that a lot of fun.
yeah, Bordy's a good guy. He spoke at the national convention when we hosted it two years ago already. So
Yeah, no, it was great. It was great. It was great. So yeah, I mean, I wish I knew somebody more in the Orioles these days, but I really don't. But yeah, that would be neat if you could get a job, especially with your background with the Babe Ruth Museum and all that stuff. That would be,
all the Saber stuff, all the
yeah.
I live downtown, so it's not like I commute very far. I'm a mile from the ballpark, so
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay. Well, good luck. And if there's anything I can do for you, let me know. I'll tell you, I would love to get more involved with the chapter. I'm just trying to find the time, and when Sinclair hired me, I'm working on this huge project for Sinclair. I basically do project management these days. And it's just between that and being a dad, and I've still got a 16-year-old that's got 3 more years of high school left, and I stay pretty busy with those things. And I figure that once I'm an empty nester and he's off in college and he doesn't have much use for the old man anymore, except the tuition checks and the beer money, that I might have more time to do some things with the chapter.
okay. Well, we're not going anywhere. So we've
Yeah,
only
yeah.
been here We hit our 9th year in June. So
Okay. Yeah.
and
That's,
then pretty much not overnight, but now we're the largest. So
oh my God, really? How many members?
well, you know how Sabre works. It is I think we probably have 200 plus that are primary. That list Babe Ruth is their primary.
Yeah.
But on our roster, we have over probably about 615.
Wow.
But that's
Holy.
because you can sit on multiple rosters, as you know. You can like I'm on probably 25 or 30, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cooperstown,
Oh, okay.
you
Yeah.
know. So the numbers are skewed, but we definitely have the most people on our roster.
Yeah. Well, very cool. Well, one of the things I would like to do for Sabre is I've noticed that I've found a bunch of I could really expand on the current Whitey Moore biography that's written. And I don't believe there is a Don Calloway biography written, and I could certainly do those bios for those guys and put those on, those Sabre bios in, and that would be a fun way to get started.
Yeah, well, Bill Nowlin, I think, still does the bios. So
Yeah, yeah. So yeah,
absolutely, you know, whatever you can contribute. That's what I tell people. It's all volunteer, and
yeah.
um, we take what we can get. So
Cool. Well, cool. Well, thank everybody that was on for me when you see them again, and tell them I appreciate listening for as long as they could. And I noticed they were dropping off, and then I saw that you were the last of the Mohicans there at the tail end. So,
well, I have to stay on because if I dropped off, you'd be
right,
talking to nobody.
right, right. Yeah, yeah. Well,
But
Peter,
I'll email you my grandfather's info, and it'd be great
yeah,
if you can look some stuff up.
do that. I'll run it through my Excel, that massive Excel spreadsheet, and see what I can come up with.
Excellent. All right. Well,
Great.
if you need anything, Drew, reach out and we'll talk.
Okay. All right. Take care, Peter.
All right. Good night.
Good night.